Good morning, everybody. Welcome to week 14 of Level 4 Sunday School. Hope you guys had a nice Thanksgiving. Sorry I missed you last week, but we should hook up next week on the 20th. So we're continuing with the Gospel of Matthew, and we're almost through sort of this main story arc of his. And I just want to reiterate that, again, Matthew was writing this really with the audience of the Jewish people at the time. So there were a lot of references or kind of callbacks to the Old Testament. And it's key that you understand that, because that's, again, he's trying to convince and explain to Jewish people how Jesus is the prophesied Messiah. And so the section we're focusing on this week is chapters 14 through 20. And this section is really about Jesus explaining both to his disciples and to people what this new kingdom is all about. So if you remember, going back, we talked about the Beatitudes, a month and change ago, where he was part of the Sermon on the Mount, and they're really explaining and clarifying a lot of the stuff in the Old Testament about the commandments say, thou shalt not do this, but the Beatitudes are, this is how you get to the kingdom of heaven. Then we talked about how he's introducing his 12 disciples, right? That he knows he's going to need other people to help spread the word because he knows he's going to die. And then there were a lot of parables about people responding to this, right? As he and his disciples came down and started to spread the word, how did people react? Some people were, very enthusiastic and believed him. Some people, especially like the religious leaders, doubted him and thought he was blasphemous. And so now we get to this section where he's in conflict with these elders, with these sort of priests of the time who were Jewish, right? And Jesus was brought up as a Jew. And so they're saying he's not the true Messiah. We think the true Messiah is going to be a strong military leader. And he also has to convince his disciples of the same thing. Like, while they believe he's the Messiah and he is the king, their view of kind of what a king should be is different than what Jesus is. And so that's what he's talking about. And some of the other key things in this section is the fact that all the stuff that you think of material sort of goods, and I think at the time they thought that was a way to get to heaven, Jesus turns that on its head and says, no, it's not about amassing great amounts of wealth to get into heaven. It's in fact the opposite. So it's really almost like an upside down world. So that's what we're going to get into in the next few pages. So I've broken down the chapters 14 through 20 into three sections here. The first one is chapters 14 and 15, and a lot of Matthew is parables, right? Of Jesus telling stories, Matthew telling the stories of things Jesus was doing and how while it happened, it's also very symbolic, right? Of what he's trying to do. So early on in chapter 14, Jesus had gone out kind of to a remote area, and a lot of people followed him because they know he was a healer and they believed he was the true Son of God. And it was getting late, and they realized, look, the disciples were saying these people should go home before it gets too dark, that we don't have food out here. And Jesus, takes this small amount of bread and fish and feeds, 5,000 people with it. And conceptually, right, I mean, it's great. He's helping people, but the idea is, right, he is saving people. He is taking, we're kind of think of it as bread and fish, but it's really, saving their souls. And this ability to, he along with the disciples can save thousands and thousands of people. That's symbolism, right, of his word and his teaching and being around him can give you not only, feed your stomach for the day or 2 days, but really feed and save your soul for the rest of eternity. These chapters also talk about him walking on water with out to a boat where Peter was, and they're amazed, right? They thought it was a ghost originally, and then Peter starts to come out and was walking on water too, and then he got scared and nervous and he started to fall, and Jesus caught him and said, basically, have faith and you will, stay afloat with me. So again, sort of the symbolism, but really there's a deeper meaning. And then again, he fed, a different story, fed another like 4,000 people with loaves and fishes. And I think one of the things I was reading about is sort of one group was Jewish that he was feeding, another group were non-Jews. And the point was, I'm saving everybody, right? That's I'm going to save everybody who wants to accept, my word can be saved and live eternal life. So again, there's a lot of different parables and examples of him healing the sick and people who are possessed by demons, but all of this gets challenged, right, by the Pharisees. And you'll see in these chapters, there's sections where they are, quizzing him and saying, why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? This is in sort of violation of what we have in the Old Testament. And so they're like building this case up of him being a false prophet and a blasphemer and somebody who ultimately, look, we know the end of the story, right? But you'll see it build up through Matthew's writings of, the elders sort of going against him. And, look, they're fearing for their lives in the sense of this is their livelihood of being the leaders of this religion. So that conflict goes on throughout Matthew. So moving ahead to chapters 16 and 17, and again, these aren't really long chapters. You guys should, take some time out and read it because it's really interesting. But he continues to be challenged, right? And what he does in chapter 16 is he actually talks about not trusting the yeast of the Pharisees, right? And so it's interesting, they talk about bread a lot, right? It was super common food, and the disciples thought he was being literal, right? Like, yeast helps bread grow, and they thought, oh, the yeast is not good from what they are. But what Jesus is talking about is don't trust what they're saying to help you grow, because it's not going to help you grow. And it's again this sort of symbolic parable type situation of what does yeast really mean, and that's interesting. But Jesus is warning the disciples, look, don't really listen to them. They're not the truth. And also during this time, Peter, Jesus asked them, who am I? Like, what am I to you? And they, Peter in particular says, look, you're the Messiah. We get it. But in Peter's mind, what is he really thinking? And we kind of find this out in the next section, because Jesus says, look, more than once, he kind of twice predicts this in these chapters. He says, I'm going to die. I'm going to be suffered. I'm going to suffer. I'm going to be tortured. And Peter's like, we're not going to let that happen. We are, you're the king, you're the Messiah, you're strong. This isn't, and we're going to help you. And Jesus is angry. And he says, no, that's not the kind of king I am. And so Peter really gets rebuked by Jesus. And, it's still hard, I think, for them in their minds to think of a king as somebody who's going to suffer. But it was a new kind of king. And that really in all of Matthew and really all the Gospels is telling us that this is a different kind of world we're trying to get into, that it's not about having the most money and having the most power and being the strongest. It's really about giving yourself up and understanding that God and Jesus are the most important. And, it's about serving and sacrifice. And so it's a very kind of different world than how the disciples were brought up. Now, in this last section, chapters 18 through 20, Matthew writes about Jesus teaching both the disciples and his followers, how do you get into heaven, right? Because people think, okay, I just follow the rules and that's it. And he starts off this section, the parable of the wandering sheep, where if a shepherd has 100 sheep and one wanders off, if you get that one back, you feel so much better about it, right? It's not to diminish the 99 who are followers, but it's the knowing you've gotten that other one who's wandered astray, and that's important, right? That you can always sort of repent and come back into the fold, right? And there's other parables too. That's maybe the biggest one, but again, it's about forgiveness, right? Forgiveness is key. And it's really kind of different from what we saw in the Old Testament, which talked about an eye for an eye and, a lot of sort of killing and violence. And Jesus is saying it's not about revenge. It's not about somebody wrongs me, I'm going to wrong them. It is forgiveness gets you into heaven. And that's one of the keys for salvation. Another parable that's really important is the parable of the rich man who says, how do I get into heaven? And Jesus says, look, you know the rules, right? You're smart. You can read. It's, honor your father and mother, don't kill, don't steal. He's like, okay, I know all that, but what else? And he's kind of insinuating, can I sort of buy my way into heaven? And Jesus is saying, no, and you can't. And in fact, you should be giving away all your money. You should sell everything, and serve others. And he walks away sad. And Jesus says, it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than a rich man to get into heaven. And the disciples, in particular Peter, are kind of confused by this, and they're like, if he can't get in, how can we get in? Because they were kind of brought up with this, you have to, give money and alms to the church to be able to get into heaven. And Jesus then kind of says something famous here, the last will be first and the first will be last. It's not about amassing wealth. It's not about accumulating wealth. That's not what honor is. True wealth comes from giving it away. That you're here to serve others, not yourself. So it really, especially for the disciples of the time, it really flipped on its head what they thought it was to get into heaven, what they thought it was to be a king. And but they've seen the miracles, right? They've seen Jesus, his acts, and they are complete believers. It's just hard for them to sort of wrap that around in their minds, that the true Son of God, the true King, is this kind of king and not the one they expected. So that's this section, which is really interesting when you understand it in the context of what the disciples were kind of going through. And again, Matthew was a Jew. He wrote this for Jewish people who understand all the references to the Old Testament really well. And we talked about how Mark is, and we'll talk later about Luke, how they're writing to a slightly different audience. So you're going to have less of the Old Testament references. But anyway, hopefully you guys get a chance to read through those chapters. I think they're really interesting, and it really lays the groundwork for what we're going to talk about next week. So with that, hopefully you have a great week, and we will see you on the 20th.